afternoon from sunny Copenhagen. Welcome to the webinar NDC Accounting Tools, the example of Ghana. This is a joint webinar by the Initiative for Climate Action Transparency, ICAT, and the Capacity Building Initiative for Transparency, CBIT. My name is Cardoso and I am the moderator for today's webinar. I want to give you a couple of housekeeping information before we move to the main content of our webinar. The webinar is going to be about 1 hour long, and this includes time for questions and answers at the end. You can ask questions at any time, even when you are listening to the presentations. Please use the panel you have from GoToWebinar. Typically, it stands on the right side of your screen. And if you have a specific question for a presenter, please name that presenter in your question. In case you cannot stay until the end of the webinar, all the materials and the recording of the webinar will be available online on the CBIT platform, www.cbitplatform.org. More information will be shared at the end with the location of the platform. And we have many other webinars and information in the CBIT platform, so visit if you want to find more interesting webinars like this one. Before we start discussing about today's webinar, I need to inform you, all our attendees, that we comply with the European Union's General Data Protection Act, also known as GDPR. This means that your personal data, such as your name, your email, workplace, is safely processed and stored, and all your rights pursuant to the GDPR law are respected. You have full access to the data being processed about you, and at any time you can request that the information is deleted or rectified. For access further information, please contact the people that are shown in this slide, my colleagues Aristides and Louise. Today's webinar, after this welcoming, there will be 2 presentations. The first one is the title is Transparency as a Basis for NDC Accounting. And then we will have another one about Ghana's nationally determined contributions, the tracking progress. And then we'll have the question and answer session. The speakers with you today are Henning Wuester. He will be following now after I finish this welcoming, and he's the director of the Initiative for Climate Action Transparency. He'll be doing the first presentation, and then we'll have Daniel Benefor. He works at the Environmental Protection Agency of Ghana, and he will do the second presentation. I'm Cardoso. I work at UNEP DTU Partnership as a researcher, and I'll mainly be moderating now and at the end the Q&A session. Thank you. This is the housekeeping information I had for you. I hope you enjoyed the webinar. I'll be back with at the end for the Q&A session. And now I give the floor to Henning for the first presentation.
So thank you, Anna, and good afternoon or good morning, colleagues. Very happy to see so many of you connected here today to join us for this webinar, and I'm very pleased that we are able to do this together with CBIT. So ICAT and CBIT really like to work together, and I think if we join forces, we can be of best service to colleagues around the world that try to enhance transparency. I hope you're all well and safe. Most of you probably tied to your desks at home. I've been saying that this is actually a good time to advance work at home on transparency frameworks, a good time to build strong data platforms for effective climate policies. So I'm really happy that so many of you are able to join us here. I'll give you a very brief introduction about ICAT, and then I'll talk about the enhanced transparency framework under the Paris Agreement. And then I'll give you a couple of examples of countries that have worked in different ways on their NDC tracking systems, Brazil, Costa Rica, and Sri Lanka, before we then hear the next presentation, which will go into more detail, which is about Ghana. So briefly about ICAT, we are a multi-stakeholder partnership made possible through funding of our 4 donors. That's the environment ministries of Germany and Italy, and 2 private foundations, the Climate Works Foundations and the Children's Investment Fund Foundation. And we are a program of UNOPS, which has a number of implementing partners, including UNEP DTU Partnership, the host of this webinar today, and a number of supporting partners, and I won't go through the full list here. Just very briefly, our work, our objective is to support enhanced transparency to enable evidence-based policymaking and implementation for accelerated climate action. We provide tools and methodologies and capacity building support to countries for policymakers and other stakeholders so that developing countries can advance work on domestic transparency frameworks. We focus very much on supporting transparency with a view to developing policies. And we offer assessment of policies for greenhouse gas levels, sustainable development, and transformational change potential. At this stage, currently ICAT works in over 30 countries, and we have active agreements with 26 of these, while the others are still being developed. Here you see the ICAT map, the over 30 countries that we are engaged with. The light and dark blue countries are those where work is actually active, while the gray ones are those where we are still developing a work plan. I should mention that we are really eager to collaborate with all experts active on transparency around the world, and together with partners like CBIT and others to build a global community of practice on climate action transparency to support enhanced action, in particularly under the NDCs, which is the main focus of this webinar today. So let me move to the next section and talk a little bit about the enhanced transparency framework under the Paris Agreement. I'll go into this just very generally, not just provide you an overview. If you like to go deeper into these issues, then I recommend you to read the guide that was prepared by UNEP DTU Partnership, which you see here on the right-hand side, and really explains in detail the enhanced transparency framework under the Paris Agreement. Articles 4 and 13 are most relevant for NDC tracking. The Article 4 defining the NDCs, and Article 13 then defining the scope of the enhanced transparency framework. There's in the enhanced transparency framework now no more distinction between Annex 1 and non-Annex 1 countries, except for the flexibility that developing countries have in engaging on the enhanced transparency framework, flexibility that takes account of different levels of capacity across the globe. The enhanced transparency framework is then further defined through the Paris Agreement rulebook, which was adopted in Katowice, and here in particular one decision that defines modalities, procedures, and guidelines for the reporting under the Paris Agreement, and that should be read in close conjunction with definition of the accounting framework of the NDCs, which defines information to facilitate clarity, transparency, and understanding of NDCs, is really the basis of what will be covered through the reporting under the enhanced transparency framework. 5 of the 8 chapters in the MPGs are relevant for countries' reporting requirements, and here the Roman numerals on this slide, they refer to these chapters in the MPGs. The reports that are most central are, or the report that is most central is the biennial transparency report, which collects all the information. It can be submitted separately or together with the national inventory report. Of course, it's important to recognize that GHG inventories are the very basis for tracking the NDCs and NDC targets. Chapter 3 of the MPGs then focuses on the information to track progress on implementing and achieving NDCs, and that's part of the mandatory reporting requirements. And I'll go further into that. The adaptation communication, just to mention it briefly here, is an additional report which is not mandatory under the ETF. And finally, to mention that the first BTR is to be submitted no later than 31 December 2024. So there's still some time to get ready for the first report, but not that much, and quite a lot of work in many countries still to be done. So let me go a bit deeper into this chapter 3 on the tracking information. We have here 6 main elements that are required to be included in the biannual transparency report. First one covers national circumstances, so that provides a broad profile of the country with some details about the population, geography, and so on. The second one then goes into the party's NDC, and it should include details about the targets. In particular, then specify related indicators, target years, reference year, and the scope of the NDC targets in terms of gases, sectors, and otherwise. Thirdly, then, most centrally, the information to track progress. Here, indicators that are used for tracking and accounting, and also the methodologies that are applied should be reported. And it's important to underline that these indicators are really chosen by each country. So it's up to each party to define the indicators that is most relevant for its NDC. So there's good room for flexibility, and it's certainly worthwhile to engage in that exercise carefully and ensure a good selection of indicators, and I'll come back to that in a little while. Then the fourth element is mitigation policies and measures. That also includes adaptation measures with mitigation co-benefits and economic diversification plans. Here, what is required is information on actions, on policies, on measures that are planned or implemented to support the implementation and achievement of the NDCs. ICAT has prepared a number of policy assessment guides that I'll come back to in a minute that can support such an assessment that help the reporting under this section here. The fifth element then refers to GHG emissions and removals. This needs to include also an inventory table, especially if the national inventory report is not submitted together with the biennial transparency report. And then last but not least, projections of GHG emissions and removals to show the quantitative information of the impact of mitigation policies and measures under different scenarios, with measures, without measures, and with additional measures. And here, of course, a tool that can help to model different scenarios is extremely useful and important in order to have a framework that provides coherent data across the economy in line with the actions that are included in the NDCs. Now, this is the reporting framework. What is important is that countries take a very pragmatic approach in looking at this. I think it's quite critical, and I would be keen to hear Daniel's views on that, to tailor the transparency framework to domestic needs and to also then apply this reporting framework very much to the domestic needs. And there are a number of flexibilities in the framework that countries can apply and should apply in order to have a setup that's most effective. I mentioned earlier that ICAT offers a number of policy assessment guides, and I want to use this opportunity just to give you an overview of what they are. This is part of the ICAT toolbox and covers a range of assessment guides for greenhouse gas emission impact assessments. Those are on the left-hand side, covering various sectors, energy, transport, and others. And then we have a number of guides that are in the middle of the slide here, covering cross-cutting issues like the assessment of sustainable development impacts of policies, the assessment of transformational change potential of policies, and the contribution from action by non-state and subnational actors. And then in addition, supporting guides on process aspects. So those really help countries to prepare some of the data and information that they will need for reporting and also for the implementation of NDCs. Let me mention here that we are launching the final version of these guides as they are now published in a series of webinars starting 2 weeks from now. So that brings me then to the third part of my presentation, to the country examples, and I'll go very briefly to those 3 examples that I want to highlight here, while then you will hear much more details about the example of Ghana, which is the next presentation. So the first example is Brazil. This work was completed last year in the summer, and it covered the assessment of a range of impacts and sets of different mitigation actions related to the NDC target. So 3 scenarios were assessed with quantified mitigation targets and measures to achieve those targets. And you see here the graph showing that the NDC target in red, and then 3 scenarios, A, B, C, which indicates that scenario A was not quite sufficient to meet the NDC target, whereas the other 2 were sufficient, and in particular scenario B was even overachieving the NDCs. So for each of these scenarios, then the work was developed to identify indicators and values that will help to evaluate progress in moving towards the implementation of these scenarios. And those indicators were then collected and compiled, including information on how to measure and assess the indicators to basically establish the MRV basis for the tracking of the Brazilian NDC. Here, just as a snapshot, the areas that the indicator framework covered. In all these sectors and subsectors, various indicators assessing absolute emissions, emission drivers, or emission intensity were developed and specified, and all of that for the 3 scenarios that were part of the assessment. And that framework then, for that framework then, a draft legislation to implement this work was prepared. The next example covers Costa Rica, and here the focus was on the transport sector, very much an advanced sector in terms of transparency and data collection. Work covered the evaluation of the existing MRV mechanisms, so in order to build on what is already out there, then an update of the roadmap in line with the NDC targets in order to develop a set of indicators for the transport sector. That MRV framework was then integrated into the Costa Rican National Climate Change Metrics System. And finally, a very important result of the assessment was that sustainable development indicators for transport mitigation actions were identified as highly relevant. This included indicators such as job creation, health impacts, road safety, and other development indicators. And in the same assessment, now we are taking this work now forward in the second phase of the ICAT project to actually integrate in the National Climate Change Metrics System, SINAMEC, sustainable development and transformational change impacts as a standard feature for the transparency framework, which actually in this now has proven to be extremely useful for the country, as they are assessing the areas where recovery spending could be utilized. And having in such a situation data on the socioeconomic impacts of policies related to climate change proves to be very useful. And let me just show to you one graph, and I'm not asking you to look at any of the details, just to get for you to get an impression of the work that was done. This was a mapping of the NDC actions that you have listed on the left-hand side against the 164 indicators for the 17 SDGs that you have across the various columns. And it was just a qualitative assessment that basically assessed whether there was an impact and whether that impact was positive or negative, and whether that impact then was strong or weak. And that's what you basically see here in the different colors. The positive impact shown with various shades of green, and the negative impact yellow or orange. And you just see this here now for 3 of the SDGs and related indicators. But as I said, this was done across the board and provided then a very thorough basis for advancing NDC action and engaging stakeholders in that context. Now let me move to the last example that I want to mention here. That's Sri Lanka. Again, here the focus was on the transport sector. And the objective of the work was both looking at the national needs in terms of the gaps in MRV and in the institutional setup for reporting data to support NDC tracking and implementation, and of course also looking at the international reporting obligations. The work covered again a systematic review of the MRV system in place, the institutional arrangements, and a very intense engagement of all the stakeholders in the transport sector, which created a very strong buy-in of all the actors. The work involved included an application of the of various methodologies, including the ICAT methodology, but also others, to measure the GHG impacts of NDC actions. Then in that process, it was possible to actually go through all the actions in the transport sector and update the actions for the transport sector at the same time as designing an MRV system for that sector. The result is now that a new set of NDC actions for the transport sector are on the table of the policymakers. So it's going into parliamentary decision making, and it has support in terms of an MRV setup to then enable and facilitate implementation. So with that, let me come to just highlight a couple of conclusions. First of all, I think it's important to ensure that all the relevant data is collected at the time when you design the transparency framework. So at that point in time, you actually tailor the transparency framework to be able to support NDC development and tracking. That's often very country specific, and it has to be done country by country, and the enhanced transparency framework gives the flexibility to tailor it to the country needs. Secondly, I would encourage all countries to think beyond the reporting requirements. Take the reporting requirements as guidance, but then build a framework that's useful for domestic purposes, and also might include economic data, for instance, that will be necessary for mobilizing finance. Thirdly, important to understand the indicators that can support NDC tracking and sharpen the formulation of the NDC targets at the same time. So when an update of the NDC is done, it's a good time to at the same time develop indicators to be sure that the targets that are actually written into the NDCs can subsequently also be measured and tracked. Fourthly, a recommendation to look at available methodologies and tools. That's part of the purpose of this webinar. And there are many of those out there to assess impacts of policies and actions. But then, and that's my final conclusion, you always will have to do some work to tailor methodologies and tools to the domestic needs and circumstances. And you should then reach out to support initiatives like CBIT and ICAT to actually be able to do that. So with that, I stop here and thank you very much for your attention, and look forward to any questions that you may have. And let me just leave my last slide announcing the upcoming webinar series to launch our ICAT assessment guidance. Thank you very much.
Hello, thank you very much. This is Daniel, and I will take you through the effort that Ghana is making to undertake the NDC accounting so far. So I'll share some few slides, and then I'll end up with a demonstration of the tool that we've come up with. So Ghana's NDC is made up of 31 actions, and those actions are made up of 11 adaptation and 20 mitigation actions, and they cover about 7 priority areas of in the economy, energy, transport, water and climate services, industry, health and forestry. It is also good to know that our NDCs are aligned with the current national development and sectorial plan. I mean, for obvious reasons, that it ought to be aligned with the national priorities and also to facilitate implementation of those actions. The implementation of these 31 actions are led by the line ministry. So they are led by the sector ministries themselves. So it is a very important point to make that once the ministries are doing the implementation, the Ministry of Environment are the ones that coordinate the implementation of the NDC actions. The Ghana EPA is responsible for the technical aspects of the implementation of the NDCs and also the planning of the NDCs and also the reporting part of it. So this effort is part of the whole effort by the government of Ghana to put in place a process for continuous reporting. But in developing the reporting system or the M&E system for the NDCs, we take note of 3 very important elements that the 31 actions, as you may see, could be very, very wide in scope, and they cover different themes, and the implementation of those actions are at different starting points, and therefore in designing such a reporting system, you need to take into account the complexities of these 31 actions as they are of different complexions. So that is a very important feature for the Ghanaians to monitor the implementation of the NDCs. The other issue is got to do with the fact that the NDCs can also be reflected in terms of the themes. So for example, the 34 actions can be seen in terms of the areas that they cover. So for example, we have a set of NDCs that focus on promoting renewable energy, clean cooking, lawn deforestation. There are some that look into promoting resilience infrastructure and others. So you can also recalibrate the NDC, the 31 actions into these broad themes. And you agree with me that these themes are the very fundamental economic development needs for the country as well. And this for us is very important. You can also see the NDCs in terms of the broad technologies of the NDC. So this is just a word cloud of the various NDCs and the technologies that is behind the NDCs. So solar PVs and all the rest are part of NDCs. The size of the text is an indication of the extent of the scope of the various NDCs. So this is what we are dealing with. We are dealing with a very wide range of development solutions that have climate imperatives. And this is the point that we want to strike here. So if we focus on only the mitigation side of things, the 20 mitigation actions are supposed to deliver a 45% reduction of our BAU emissions of 74 million tons by 2030, which fundamentally translates into a 34 million ton emission reduction potential for the country if we fully implement this target. The 20 mitigation target actions are also divided into conditional and unconditional measures. So there are 2 of them that are unconditional measures, of which the implementation is expected to lead to 11 million tons of emission reductions. The remaining 18 are supposed to lead to 20 million tons of emission reductions. The 2 of them, when we sum them up, we expect that the 45 million tons, the 45 emission reduction targets would lead to a total of 34 million tons of emission reductions by 2030. So this is just a breakdown of emissions in terms of conditional and unconditional. And also, we've also divided the targets according to sectors. So you can see that the energy sector has the most 12 measures in that sector, and it of course would have the highest emission reduction potential. So the distribution of the 20 measures are first of all distributed by condition and unconditional measures, and also according to sectors. The two unconditional measures, there's one in the energy sector, there's also one in the forestry sector, and that is what is leading to the 11 million tons of emission reductions. The others, so for example, if you go within the energy sector and you break it down further into themes, you can see that there are very specific themes and their corresponding emission reductions. So we have fuel switch, we have combined cycle, conversion to combined cycle, we have reduced gas flaring, and all these are the individual mitigation measures within the 12 mitigation actions in the energy sector and what their emission reduction potential could look like. And then this comes also with forestry. So forestry, we have 3 specific measures under forestry that are supposed to lead to achieving lowering deforestation and enhancing carbon stocks. And these are their corresponding emission reductions as well. The same for waste. There are 3 sub-interventions under waste: landfill gas flaring, composting, and biogas. And then transport, and also HFC phase out under industry. So these are the broad overview of the 20 mitigation actions per sector, and also categorized into conditional and unconditional and their corresponding emission reductions. So these are very important steps that we did just to break everything down to understand who at where is playing what role and their effects. So apart from understanding the complexion of the 20 NDCs, we also took note that we are also going to have different funding arrangements for the 20 measures, right? So there'll be domestic financing, of which the emission reductions can't simply be used to meet the emission target for the unconditional targets. We could also access financing from market-based and non-market-based mechanisms for which the emissions could be transferred to a third party, and that will require us to adjust those emissions as and when they occur. So we also took note of the different financing arrangements that are available for us and the implications of the emission reductions in the accounting. So what are we tracking? So we are tracking the NDC progress. And before we can track the NDC progress, to us, we think we need 4 very important elements. The first element is the baseline emissions. We need to understand what the baseline emissions were during when we are constructing the emission projections for the NDCs. We need data on the GHG inventories every year. We need to understand the implications of the emission targets for each sector, for each category, and for each theme. We also need to find a way to compute the GHG effects of each of these actions. That's the first part. And together, we think that these elements can allow us to track the NDC progress. And that's the focus of this presentation. We also need to track adaptation effects. So we are looking at different aspects of adaptation and their effects, risk, beneficiaries, and different investments. Already, Henning also mentioned about the co-benefit of these actions as well. So we are tracking all these. We intend to track all these elements, we also need to discuss how are we going to track it, or how do we intend to track it, and what is our approach. Our approach is very simple. Our approach is to simply indicate that the system for tracking the performance of the NDCs and progress, the system must be embedded in the existing national M&E infrastructure that is managed by the National Development Planning Commission. And that for us is the easiest and the cost-effective way of tracking the performance of the NDCs without having to create a parallel system. So that's the first thing. We also need to emphasize the fact that in as much as we are seeking to embed or integrate this into the existing systems, we also need to begin to work towards automation. Automate the effort of monitoring and processing and communication and visualization. Another approach that we have also adopted is to develop indicators for the specific NDCs, for the line ministries to use to monitor the performance and progress of these NDCs, which we have done with the National Planning Commission. Of course, for this presentation, we have also developed an NDC accounting tool to track the mitigation component of the NDC, which is based on the GASMO model and also the work that was done by GIZ to develop a tool. So who does the tracking at 3 levels? So tracking is done at 3 levels, at the national level, sectoral level, and also the district level. So once we say that each ministry is responsible for tracking of the performance of their respective NDCs, they use indicators that people have been assigned to track the performance or the implementation of those NDCs in their respective ministries and report through their sectorial annual progress report, for which then they will submit those reports to the National Planning Commission, and then the Planning Commission will then prepare the National Annual Progress Reports. So that is the overall thinking and arrangement behind what we are tracking, our approach, and who is doing the tracking. So I'll focus on the development, the use of the NDC accounting tool. So what are the characteristics of this tool? To us, it's a very simple tool, and it should be simple for everybody to use. We have built the tool using existing country reports, data from the existing country reports. So we are talking about the data that we use to develop our NDCs, our national communications, economic data sets, energy data sets. So these data sets that we used came from the country report. Again, the tool is simplified because the calculations are, you can see the formula, and the cells automatically generate the results once you fill in the relevant portions of the cells. The data, the tool is not data intensive. Of course, it's flexible. You can adapt it to fit any different data situations. Another very interesting feature of the tool is that it is open source. It is based on Excel, but it can link to any other model that you think your country is already in use, and the results can almost always be linked to the Excel sheets. One very nice feature of it is also the fact that it is transparent. Anybody can see the formula, but it allowed us to systematically arrange the data in a manner that it is logical and meaningful. And to us, any country or any institution can try and develop their own tool based on these principles. So what do you need to be able to build this tool? For us, the first important thing you need is the data from your sectorial and national baseline emissions. Remember, these baseline emissions were computed when you were developing your NDCs. So if you have that data available with you, you need that data set in constructing your NDC accounting tool. Since you understand the calculation behind those baseline emissions, it's important that you use that information. The next important thing is that take note that these baseline emissions are calculated from your national greenhouse gas inventory data. And therefore, the GHG inventory data for your country is also crucial. And here I'm referring to the historical GHG data that was used in computing your baseline emissions. The next set of data that you need in building this tool is, again, the data from your mitigation target or the mitigation commitments that can be expressed by sector or by individual actions. Again, take note that the effect of the individual mitigation actions determine your total national mitigation targets. And therefore, if you have structured your individual actions very well and computed their mitigation potential, you could simply aggregate them to get your mitigation target. And I presume that is what was done in your country. And therefore, tools like LEAP or GASMO or any other tool can be used to produce both the baseline emissions and also the mitigation effect of your NDCs. You need that set of data as well. Another set of data that you need, crucial, is your annual GAG inventory, which is developed from the first year after your baseline. So in Ghana, our baseline for the NDCs, the first one was 2016. So we need, anytime we report our GAG inventory for 2017, 2018, that information is very crucial to compare to the emission baselines that we produce. So we need our annual GAG inventory that is attributable to the NDCs. The next very important set of data that you need is also the individual mitigation actions and their effects. So you also need to look at that as well, that once you have indicators for individual actions and the performance of the individual actions, you need that information in the NDC accounting tool. When you get these very 4 important data sets to us, you think it is easy to track your NDC's performance over time. So this is the representation of what we've done so far. So that for us to get the NDC progress, we need to know our annual GAG inventory data every year. The reason is that it will help us to compare the annual inventory results with the projected baseline emission to be able to evaluate whether or not the extent of deviation of our GAG inventory figures from the base year emissions. Another option is to compute the individual mitigation actions and their effects and aggregate the effects. We are also, interestingly, generating emission reductions that are eligible for payment, and that information also comes from our emission registry. That is also very crucial for us. And also the other side is also the support that we've received. So I'll focus on the emission baseline, the emission projections, the emission targets, the annual emissions, the emission reductions of each individual NDCs or the aggregate effect. And that is what we used to compute or track the NDCs. So the Excel sheet was built on this concept. So this is how it looks like. So the first blue line here is your historical emissions. And the next one, which is the number 2, is your projected business as usual emissions. So once your GAG inventory gives you the figures for one, of course, I'm sure that in your country you had already computed the number 2 already, which defines the BAU trajectory. Ghana has conditional and unconditional trajectory. So the number 3 represents our unconditional trajectory, which is basically going to lead to an ultimately 11 million tons of emission reductions. The target number 4 is giving us the conditional targets. It means that whatever we get at number 5, it is the result of the effort that we implement when it comes to the unconditional measures. Number 6 is taking into account what is called the conditional measures and their effects. So number 6 and 5 gives us the total effect of the 20 mitigation actions. We also hold a view that there will be other mitigation actions beyond the 20 measures and their effects. And those measures would occur though, and we call those measures as measures that are outside the NDCs. So the total effect of the NDC measures plus the measures that are outside the NDCs are computed between 5, 6, and 7. What is left is the emissions in the inventory is captured at 8. So this is the foundation of the Ghana's NDC accounting tool. So this is how it is. To your left here is our 2016 GAG inventory result for the sectors. It gives us a baseline of 20 or a base year emissions of 42 million tons. And we had done our projections using the gas flow model to project it to 75 million tons according to the sectors. So this has been done already during the formulation of our NDCs. Now we have 11 million ton unconditional targets, which is to be implemented by 2 measures in energy and forestry. And then we have an additional, so the additional 18 measures would lead to 23 million tons. What is left is the emissions that would be accounted for in the GHG inventories when we account for all the emission reductions and the rest that is left. And the red line, these lines are the lines that we are going to use to measure the progress towards attaining our target. And the emission reductions could come in all these forms. And then we have this as well. So this is very crucial. So to the left side, we use the IPCC guidelines, and then to this side, we are going to use the gas mode tool for the emission projections, and then the emission reduction potential, and also the tracking of the NDC progress. So this is the whole thing. So it means that we need to have these four very fundamental elements. The first one is our baseline emissions. The second one is our mitigation commitment. The third one is our annual GHG inventory over the NDC period. The fourth one is the individual or the aggregate NDCs and their effect. And then the fifth one is any corresponding adjustment that would come from emissions transfers out of the country. So this is a very simple formula that we took from the GIZ work, which simply compute the progress if we choose. There are 2 proposals that we have put forward: the inventory-based tracking of the NDCs and also the measure-based tracking of the NDCs. So the inventory-based tracking is when you use your inventory results to compare to your baseline emissions, and then option 2 is the measure-based result when you compute the effect of your individual actions and aggregate them and compare it to your baseline emissions. And therefore, this is a very simple one. So for us, we are computing the annual emissions plus any corresponding adjustment minus the annual GHG inventory results to see the performance of the country's effort to attain its own targets. And this we intend to provide an indicative reporting in the DTR, and we intend to do the final accounting by 2030. There's also an option of choosing the option B, which was also proposed within the GIZ tool, to simply compute the effects of these actions and compare it with the baselines. So I'll quickly do a demo with. What's very crucial, what you are seeing here are the individual NDC actions and their indicators. So for each of the 20 actions, you see that we have a threshold target and then the unit and the indicators. So each ministry has a copy of this, and their job is to use these indicators to monitor the performance of the NDC actions to your left. So this was computed. This is the potential emission reductions per each unit of the NDC target for each measure. So we computed this using the gas model. So for each unit, for example, so for every 1 megawatt of natural gas power capacity that you add, this is the expected emission reductions that you accrue. And once we get to the 100, so if you want to compute the 100 megawatts addition, you just simply multiply this one by the total target. So this is this table is the data collection template that every ministry uses. So each ministry will have a copy of this, and then they will fill this form, and this form is what is used for for the computation. So I'm at the live demonstration. So this is the NDC tracking tool for Ghana, and as you can see, the first thing you do is to first of all categorize your emission sectors by the national sectors, as you can see here. So we have categorized the sectors and link the sectors to the IPCC sectors. We have also categorized the 20 mitigation actions according to sectors as well. The first thing you need to do is to go to your GAG baseline. So this is the GAG baseline. So this is our GAG baseline at a national level, and also per sector, and also per category. So the red line is the baseline for from the GAG inventories, and the rest were projected up to 2030. And then once you have this, in this tool, you can't touch these figures. It ought to be the same because these figures were agreed upon when the NDCs were published. The next one is the sectors with the mitigation commitment. So these are the sectors with the mitigation commitment here. Again, the users of the tool are not allowed to touch these figures. These figures can only be changed when the NDCs are updated. So in this sense, we have two unconditional targets, one in the fossil fuel power plants and one in forestry. So what we did was that once we have a total target of 15%, we simply annualized the target and had 1.1% per annum over the 14 years, and we applied the annualized targets to the respective categories where we have the unconditional targets. Those ones are in blue. And then the conditional target is 30%, and when you annualize it, you get 2.1% per annum for 14 years, and we applied it to all the categories that we had the conditional measures. So after here, the user have the choice to either do inventory-based tracking or the measure-based tracking. So for the inventory-based tracking, it simply depends on your GAG inventory result. So when you put in your GAG inventory result for each year, for example, it generates, and it's done per each sector. It generates the result automatically for the user, and then it compares it up. So the result here compares the results that you have for each GAG inventory year and compare it with your projections and see how you are deviating from your projected BAU emissions. That is the purpose of this. So every year that you do your annual GAG inventory, you need to compute or input the results here, and the result will be compared with your BAU emission results and see whether you are on track or not. You also have the option to do the measure-based approach. I think my time is up.
Yes, thank you so much for these wonderful presentations. We have a couple of questions for Daniel and for Henning. I'll go first to the questions for Daniel. A lot of people want to know how did you overcome data collection issues at national level for the GAG inventory, and not only that, but also for the MRV of policies and actions. And also, and how do you deal with mitigation policies that have interacting effects? So if you, Daniel, could speak a bit about these two issues.
Okay, so first of all, it's important to note that in Ghana, the responsibility of the GAG inventory has been decentralized, and it's been decentralized to the various ministries. So for example, the Ministry of Energy or the Energy Commission is responsible for their respective inventories. So they are responsible for collecting the data within their system. Now, what they are doing, which is for us very crucial, is the fact that the Energy Commission has a system to produce the annual energy balance. So the process that is used to produce the annual energy balance is what is used to also collect the data for GHG inventory. So what we are seeking to do right now is to completely embed the GHG inventory data collection with the annual compilation of the energy balance. That is the one critical thing that is for us a good practice. The other part of it is also the question on how do we evaluate mitigation actions that have multiple benefits or multiple effect or cause effect. We are yet to look into that. We know that is a possibility. We are yet to look into how we will address that in the model.
Okay, so another question is about the tool that you demonstrated. What is the status right now, if it has been deployed, and who's going to use it, and how do you plan to engage stakeholders in using this tool? Okay,
so the tool is about to be fully deployed. It will be deployed when we publish our enhanced NDC this year, and then it will come with the enhanced NDCs. Secondly, the tool is going to be used by the line ministries, and each line ministry has an NDC contact person, and each NDC contact person would be trained to, and his or her colleagues will be trained on how to use this tool. A copy of this tool is also going to be with the National Planning Commission, which has the overarching mandate of MNE in the country as well. We are yet to decide whether to give a copy of this tool to private sector or non-state actors. That is yet to be decided, and in which form.
Much, Daniel. I have a question also for Henning. Henning, if you can hear us, and if you can respond to this question about how is the use and impact of ICAT methodologies measured? Has this been tracked? Is there already any information about impact and use of these methodologies?
Yeah, thank you very much. We've just completed an evaluation of the first phase of ICAT, and that includes also a tracking of the impacts of applying the methodologies. I mean, it's a qualitative assessment, and was done through a survey of both government and expert participants in ICAT work, and basically the big picture feedback was positive on the usefulness of the ICAT methodologies. I should add that the methodologies in many cases were complemented through additional work and through other methods. We are not suggesting that the methodologies will be a one size fits all. And it's also important to recognize that the best use of the methodologies is applying several of these methodologies in combination. So some of the sectoral methodologies together with cross-cutting assessments, and of course some of the process guides to support the work.
Very much. And another question, I think maybe also other people have this question: how can countries become part of ICAT? If you could give a quick answer to that, for those that are interested in becoming part of this initiative.
Yeah, we had a call for expressions of interest to countries last year that ended in late December, and we had a very large number of expressions of interests. We are now in the process of raising additional resources so that we can open up to more countries to join us. But if there's an interest, please let us know and use our email address, and it's important for us to know if such an interest is there, and we can then engage. Thank you.
That email address is in the presentation that you showed, right?
Correct. ICAT@unops.org. It's quite simple.
Okay, thank you so much. So, dear attendees, finally we come to the end of this webinar. I would like to say thank you to the panelists for these very informative and interesting presentations. I regret we didn't have time to have more into details of the tool. Possibly we're gonna maybe think about other webinars. And I would like to thank the audience for their questions. There are more questions we couldn't answer here, but we will collect them and collect the answers of them and publish the answers of those. Thank you for your attention, and I wish you a good day, good continuation of this day from sunny Copenhagen. Thank you.